When she stops calling or messaging, when the usual pattern of communication suddenly fades into silence, it's tempting to believe that she's just moved on, or maybe got busy, or that she's indifferent. But often that silence is deliberate. It's not always about disinterest. Sometimes it's a quiet test, a psychological probe, a way of asking a deeply personal question without using any words. Do I still matter to you? People don't always express their needs directly, especially in emotional dynamics. They communicate through patterns, reactions, changes in rhythm. When a woman who used to be consistent in reaching out suddenly goes quiet, it might not be because she's lost interest. It might be because she wants to see whether you will notice the void she's left behind. Whether your mind registers her absence as something worth reacting to. That silence becomes a mirror. It reflects your level of engagement, your awareness, your emotional investment or lack thereof. What's important here is understanding how subtle yet powerful this non-verbal strategy can be. We tend to think that relationships evolve through overt communication, but very often the deepest signals are sent through absence, through withdrawal. When she stops initiating, she may be stepping back to see where she really stands in your hierarchy of importance. Not because she's playing games, but because she's reaching for clarity in a quiet, almost subconscious way. It's the kind of move that reveals more about you than about her. Because what you do in response, or what you don't do, tells her exactly how valued she is in your internal world. She doesn't want a speech. She doesn't need paragraphs of justification. She wants to feel from your behavior whether her silence creates an echo inside of you or just passes unnoticed. And here's where it gets interesting. That silence is uncomfortable by design. It's not meant to feel good. It's meant to draw your attention inward, to raise questions you hadn't considered. Did you take her presence for granted? Did you assume she'd always be there, always reaching out, always putting in the effort to bridge the distance? Because if you did, her silence becomes the correction to that assumption. In many ways, it's not about the absence of her voice, it's about the absence of your response. That's what she's really watching. She wants to know if you feel her missing energy, if you sense her withdrawal, and what you choose to do about it. And often she won't explain any of this. She'll just let the silence do the talking. Because when a woman wants to know her place in your life, she'll often step out of it just far enough to see if you'll reach to pull her back in. And if you don't, that silence will eventually become permanent. When she stops calling or messaging you and you find yourself staring at a screen that stays blank for days, maybe weeks, it's easy to fall into a trap of assuming she's just over it. That she's detached, moved on, emotionally disconnected. But here's a nuance most people miss. Silence doesn't always mean apathy. Sometimes it's self-preservation. Sometimes it's the space she creates, not because she doesn't care, but because she cares too much and doesn't know what to do with that vulnerability anymore. You see, when someone withdraws, especially after a period of emotional closeness, that gap often holds more meaning than the words you use to exchange daily. Silence can scream. It can express frustration, fatigue, disappointment, or even fear. And in many cases, she's not trying to punish you by stepping away. She's trying to protect herself from the emotional toll of feeling undervalued, unheard, or unseen. People can only give so much without receiving in return. They can only pour out attention, affection, energy without a reciprocal gesture until they start to question their own worth. So when she pulls back, that decision might be built on a quiet accumulation of unmet emotional needs. Maybe she reached out repeatedly and felt your disinterest. Maybe her vulnerability wasn't met with presence. Maybe she simply started to feel like a ghost orbiting someone else's life, hoping for warmth that never arrived. And when that feeling persists long enough, silence becomes her answer. It's not always dramatic. It's not always stormy. Sometimes the most painful exits happen in total quiet. Because when someone's exhausted from explaining how they feel and nothing changes, they eventually stop talking altogether. That silence, again, isn't emptiness. It's filled with conclusions. Now, it's important to recognize how this affects your understanding of emotional connection. You might look at the lack of messages and interpret it as a sign that she doesn't want to communicate. But what's more likely is that she no longer knows whether her communication matters. And that's a different kind of silence entirely, one rooted in resignation, not disinterest. Here's the real point. If she pulled back, it wasn't random, it wasn't just a shift in mood or a whim, it was built moment by moment out of small disappointments, out of conversations that didn't feel safe, or moments when she needed depth and got distance instead. And when someone reaches that point, they don't always announce their departure. They just stop knocking on a door that never opened. So when you find yourself wondering why she's gone quiet, don't just ask what she's doing now. Ask what she felt before she disappeared. Because the silence you're experiencing today is often the echo of all the times her voice wasn't truly heard. Sometimes the silence isn't about you at all, at least not in the way you think. It isn't necessarily a calculated move, nor is it always filled with bitterness or resentment. It might be her way of trying to find herself again. After giving so much, caring so deeply, and possibly even losing parts of her own identity in the process, the quiet might be where she starts reclaiming her center. She's not reaching out because, for once, she's choosing to reach inward. And that's not an act of revenge or cruelty, it's an act of survival. When someone spends so much time invested in a relationship, especially one where they may have constantly sought validation or clarity, they can begin to drift from their own internal compass. Their emotions become reactions instead of reflections. Their sense of peace becomes dependent on whether or not a message gets returned or whether or not they're being understood. And when that happens, a tipping point is inevitable. Silence then becomes her only way of hearing her own voice again after it's been drowned out by the noise of confusion or longing. This is often misunderstood. You might assume she's moved on, that her quietness means indifference. But sometimes she's simply exhausted, not because she doesn't care, but because she cared too much for too long without anything meaningful in return. She gave her attention freely. She waited, hoped, perhaps even cried in private, until she decided that enough was enough. And so now she isn't messaging, not because she wants to play games, but because she's tired of playing a role that only leads to more pain. This withdrawal is less about causing you to suffer and more about choosing not to suffer herself anymore. It's not the cold shoulder. It's not a strategic silence meant to manipulate you. It's a necessary quiet space where she can remember what it feels like to belong to herself, maybe for the first time in a long time. And here's the thing, if she's doing that, if she's stepping back to tend to the parts of her that were neglected, that's not a sign of weakness. It's strength, a different kind of strength, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, the kind that doesn't need to make a show of its pain or prove a point to anyone. She's reclaiming her self-worth in private, and that act alone speaks volumes. So don't always assume the silence is about pushing you away. Sometimes it's about pulling yourself back together. Sometimes it's about finally realizing she's done waiting for someone else to notice her value. And in that decision, she might find a peace that no amount of chasing ever gave her. One of the more painful truths to accept is that sometimes when she doesn't reach out, it's because she's testing the silence itself, trying to see how long it takes before you notice she's gone, or if you even care at all. That silence, in her mind, becomes a measuring stick, a subtle experiment in emotional detachment. She might not be entirely over you. She might still care. But there's a part of her that's grown weary, that's begun to question her own place in your life. So instead of asking outright, she stops calling, stops texting, stops showing up. And she watches quietly to see what you'll do with the absence. And this isn't always about playing games. It's about truth, about clarity, about finding out what the relationship really meant once the performance ends. Because the absence of effort reveals more than the presence of words ever could. And if her silence is met with your silence, she begins to draw conclusions. Not always fair ones, perhaps, but real to her. She may tell herself, if I mattered, he'd notice. If I meant something, he wouldn't just let me disappear. And the longer the quiet stretches, the louder those doubts become. You see, this kind of silence is not hollow, it's loaded. Loaded with all the emotions she didn't feel safe enough to express before. The vulnerability, the fear, the hope. All packed into a decision to say nothing at all. because saying something too soon might expose how deeply she still cares. And when you're tired of feeling like you're the only one who cares, silence feels like the only form of self-respect left. So when you find yourself on the receiving end of that stillness, don't be too quick to assume she's indifferent. Real indifference is colder, cleaner. What she's doing is different. There's uncertainty in it, maybe even sadness. There's a trace of longing hidden beneath the quiet, but she's using it as a last resort to protect herself, because reaching out again without any sign from you, without reassurance that she still matters, feels like too much to risk. And if you miss the moment, if you brush it off as just another phase, she'll take that as confirmation. Confirmation that her feelings weren't reciprocated in the way she hoped, that she was right to pull away, that your silence meant you had already moved on, even if that wasn't true. And that's when she starts to let go for real, not out of strength, but out of necessity. Not because she wants to, but because she doesn't know what else to do. And by the time you realize what that silence really meant, it may already be too late to answer it. Sometimes when she stops calling or messaging you, it's not because she's done, it's because she's finally exhausted, emotionally drained, not angry, not spiteful, just empty. She's given so much of herself, her energy, her patience, her time. And at some point, when it feels like none of it has made a difference, silence becomes her default state. Not because she wants to push you away, but because she's slowly realizing that pulling herself back might be the only way to feel sane again. You see, when a woman starts off invested, she gives deeply. She doesn't just reach out with words, she reaches out with hope. Every message, every call, every attempt to stay connected is really her way of saying, this matters to me, you matter to me. But when those gestures go unnoticed, or worse, get taken for granted, it chips away at her belief in the relationship. She doesn't stop because she wants to hurt you. She stops because continuing to try starts hurting her. And the thing is, it's not always one big moment that causes her to fall silent. It's the accumulation of small, overlooked things. The unreturned texts, the emotionally flat responses, the missed opportunities to make her feel seen. Every time she tried to connect and felt like she was talking into a void, it left a mark. And she held on longer than most would have, hoping that maybe one more effort would turn the tide. But eventually she reached that invisible threshold where trying just started to feel humiliating. At that point, silence is no longer just a reaction, it's self-protection. It's her way of saying, I can't keep doing this to myself. And when that happens, don't confuse her quiet with coldness. She still feels, often more than you realize, but now those feelings are internalized. Now they sit with her in the silence, and that quiet starts to shape her choices going forward, not because she stopped caring, but because she had to care for herself in a way you weren't able to. The danger, of course, is that her silence gets misread, that you interpret her distance as disinterest, and you mirror it back. And suddenly, two people who once meant something to each other become strangers, simply because one stopped calling and the other didn't ask why. And that's how people lose each other. Not in explosive arguments, but in quiet withdrawals that neither side was brave enough to interrupt. And by the time you realize that her silence was actually her final cry for connection, she may already have learned to live without needing one. And then there's the moment you start seeing her name pop up in subtle ways. An old story viewed, a like on a post from weeks ago, a song she used to love appearing on your recommended playlist because she played it endlessly when you were together. These aren't coincidences. Not always. Sometimes they're soft signals, gentle, indirect attempts to re-enter your mind without saying a word. Because silence isn't just absence, it can be strategy, especially when pride and vulnerability are locked in a quiet battle. When she doesn't call or message you for a long time, and suddenly there's a flicker, an accidental view of your story, a quiet presence that lingers just enough to make you wonder, it means something is stirring. Maybe it's curiosity, maybe it's longing, maybe it's just that she hasn't really let go. But instead of reaching out directly, she takes the safer route. Because the silence she's maintained has become a kind of armor now. It protects her from rejection, from being the only one still feeling something. She wants to know if you're still there, not physically necessarily, but emotionally. She wants to see if she still lives somewhere in your awareness, if a part of you still notices her even in the background. It's not necessarily manipulation. It's a test, a quiet check-in to measure the temperature of your absence. And if you respond, even subtly, she'll feel it, not through words, but through recognition. She'll sense that her silent signal wasn't ignored. But here's the deeper part. Sometimes she doesn't even realize she's doing it. Sometimes her fingers hover over your name out of habit, not intention. Sometimes she checks your profile, not because she wants to rekindle anything, but because she's still trying to understand what went wrong. People don't just erase attachments. We carry them. We investigate them in quiet moments when no one's watching. And sometimes the only way she knows how to process that is to orbit your world at a distance. And it drives her mad. Because that need for connection, mixed with the fear of being vulnerable again, creates a storm inside her. She doesn't want to look weak. She doesn't want to seem desperate. But the silence is no longer peace. It becomes noise. Loud, deafening noise. And you, the person she once trusted with her heart, have become the one she's afraid to approach. This is where many connections quietly die, not because the feelings disappeared, but because both sides waited too long, circling each other in silence, hoping the other would make the first move. But nothing haunts a person more than realizing they lost something not through conflict, but through hesitation. And by the time she works up the courage to break that silence, it's often too late to hear what might have been said.